Okay, now what I'd like to do here is talk you through the Monarch desktop timeline. Okay, so it's kind of a walk down the history of the desktop of the product. Okay, all right, so excuse me. Um, Starting in 1990, so starting in 1990, the original version, version one of the product, was launched, and it was a DOS version. It wasn't even a Windows version, it was DOS, and it was purely working with text files. Okay, and this era in 1990 up until 2015 is what you call the Monarch Classic only era. In other words, Monarch Classic was the only application that was available at the desktop level. Okay, um, so 1990 to I guess up to 2000 versions 1 through 4. In version 5 in 2000, they introduced the ability to uh, use external lookups. Basically, so if you extracted data from a text file, you could bring in another file, well, most likely a database. You could bring in like a spreadsheet or an Access database and do a VLOOKUP, a very simple VLOOKUP in Classic. In 2001, version 6 introduced the ability to work with HTML files. In 2003, version 7 introduced the multi-column region capability, and then they increased the number of external lookups up to 9 that could work with it with a model. 2 years after that, in 2005, in version 8, was the first time Monarch could work with PDF files. In 2007, version 9 provided support for Excel 1997 and OLEDB connection support. And then in 2008, version 10 provided support for Excel pivot tables and support for Excel 2007. And a lot of customers considered version 10 to be the best Monarch version ever. Most likely version 10.5. That was a very popular version. Version 11 provided support for Excel 2010, and it was possibly the time that declaring template, the ability to declare a template, was introduced. And then version 12, um, the desktop version was rebranded as DataWatch Desktop. Okay, so there you have it. So, you know, 1990 to 20, uh, I guess 2015, or maybe 2014, I guess, up until 2015 was a purely Monarch Classic era. Now in 2015, uh, version 13 introduced the first version of Data Prep Studio. And I got to be honest with you, it was good, but it wasn't that good. I mean, because I started using the product around 2013. So I started using the product at the tail end of the Monarch Classic only era. And um, I remember when Data Prep Studio was introduced and I looked at it, I was like, oh man, that looks pretty cool. But one of the huge drawbacks at that time was that you could not bring in your classic models that you already had. So you'd always have to rebuild stuff from scratch in Data Prep Studio. Uh, now a year later in 2016, in version 14, and specifically version 14.3, I mean, it was amazing because then you could bring in your classic models. And when I saw that, I was like, wow, okay, this is really cool. And then in 2018, version 15, uh, you could finally, now in version 14, you could import your classic models, but you couldn't modify them. And then in 2018, you could bring in your classic models, you could modify them, and then you could also build from scratch. Um, okay, and then in 2020, now 2020 was a milestone year. I mean, this was the 30-year anniversary for the product. And so what the product team did is they launched a new look. So they changed the look from this sort of blue interface to this newer interface. And they had a whole bunch of new capabilities that they started to introduce. And to bring the long story short, it took them 10 years. It took them 10 years to go from the launch of Data Prep Studio to going to 2025. It took them 10 years to take all of the capabilities from Classic and bring them into Data Prep Studio. They just kind of, they just kept chipping away at it year after year and bringing in more of the capabilities. And then, of course, they added additional capabilities in Data Prep Studio that are not in Classic, like the PDF table extractor, um, the the worksheet design. And I'm surprised I'm not seeing that here because I think the worksheet design was also introduced in 2020. So a lot of really cool features and capabilities. Okay, so in summary, you had basically three eras. You had the classic only era, and most people at that time when they would use Monarch Classic, you would build your models and then most likely export that data into Excel and do additional work in Excel. We're talking VLOOKUPs, pivot tables, macros, all kinds of stuff. And then the 2015 to 2019 era was sort of the introduction of Data Prep Studio, um, right? Which was, you know, it was great after version 14, but even then it was still because you're kind of in this in between era where you're like, oh my goodness, I love that this Data Prep Studio can do a lot more now, but I'm still having to go back to Classic because all the capabilities aren't there yet. So you kind of had to live in between Classic and Data Prep Studio in this time, and then you know uh, exporting your data to Excel and all that kind of stuff. Now, okay, now the era that we live in now is what you call the Data Prep Studio parity with Classic. Now everything you could have done in Classic, you could do it all in Data Prep Studio now, right? And so um, it is the go forward application for learning Monarch today. Okay. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the timeline. I think the next thing we're going to discuss is the different file types. So I'll stop here. We'll talk about the different file types. And then I think after that, we'll start to actually look at use cases.